It was a cold dawn in London on December 14, 1838. William Cox, a night porter in Buckingham Palace, shivered and yawned as he warmed his hands beside one of the building's fireplaces. Above the sound of crackling flames, he heard the squeak of door hinges as somebody entered the room. Cox turned around to greet the colleague who'd relieve him at the end of his long shift. He gasped when he saw that the person creeping up behind him wasn't a colleague. It was a strange, filthy teenage boy with a wide mouth and a protruding brow. As soon as he was spotted, the intruder fled. When Cox attempted to give chase, he tripped and fell onto an overflowing sack stuffed with men's trousers, women's underwear, foreign coins, a book, a padlock, and a ceremonial sword. The confused night porter picked himself up off the floor and analyzed the scene. The trespasser had left behind a trail of chimney soot. He had vandalized a portrait of the Queen. Worse yet, he had opened several private letters stolen from her bedroom. Cox thanked God that the 19-year-old Victoria had spent the night in Windsor Castle. Who knows what the intruder might have done if she'd been in her bed at Buckingham? Fearing what might happen if that intruder escaped, Cox called the police. Soon, a full-scale search was underway. When a constable cornered the boy behind a pillar, he tried to grab hold of him. The boy, however, was completely coated in some kind of grease or slime, so he slipped free and ran away again. The police pursued him. Finally, they pinned him down. As he wriggled in their grasp, they discovered that he'd dressed himself in multiple pairs of pants. In between them, he'd crammed several stolen women's undergarments. The boy reluctantly informed the police that he was Edward Cotton, the son of a humble tradesman. His body was slathered with bear grease, a common hair care product. Apparently, he'd thought that it would help him squeeze out of the palace through a narrow chimney. The police asked Edward how he'd entered royal quarters in the first place. He claimed that he'd migrated to London from the English countryside about a year ago. When he arrived in the big city, a mysterious man in an expensive-looking jacket had invited him inside of Buckingham and snuck him past the guards. Since then, Edward had lived like a stowaway. By day, he slept in a chimney flue. By night, he stole food from pantries. The police doubted this story. For one thing, nobody believed that someone could live undetected inside Buckingham for 11 months. For another thing, Edward's strong Cockney accent hinted that he'd grown up in the heart of London, not the English countryside. Law enforcement agents posted ads in local newspapers to ask whether the public knew the boy's identity. A few days later, a haggard-looking Londoner appeared at the police station to retrieve his missing son. The boy known as Edward Cotton had given the police a fake surname and backstory. His real name was Edward Jones, and he'd spent his entire life in London. Ever since dropping out of school at 12 years old, he'd worked various menial jobs, but his bosses had inevitably fired him for laziness. In time, Edward's father, who was trying to raise 7 children in a small apartment in a slum, grew exhausted with his good-for-nothing son. After several warnings, he kicked 14-year-old Edward out of the house. 1 week later, the police caught the boy trespassing inside of Buckingham. They charged him with theft. To everyone's surprise, Edward fared well in court. The royal family inadvertently crippled the prosecution's case by forbidding them from introducing Queen Victoria's damaged portrait, purloined letters, or stolen underwear as evidence. Edward's lawyer, meanwhile, portrayed him as a silly, naive little child who delighted in smearing himself with the Queen's high-quality bear grease. Edward's so-called burglary, the lawyer claimed, was nothing more serious than an outburst of imaginative fancy. He didn't want to steal the Queen's belongings. He wanted to meet and befriend her at a time of great personal hardship. Moved by the defense's argument, the jury found Edward not guilty. This verdict made the teenager a media sensation. Journalists, marveling at his capers, gave him the nickname by which he's most often known today, the Boy Jones. He appeared in newspaper cartoons. Playwrights authored comedies about his actions. The news cycle, however, was almost as short during the 19th century as it is today. After his 15 minutes of fame had expired, the boy Jones was once again an unremarkable citizen accepting menial jobs, then losing them due to his laziness. Under normal circumstances, his story might have ended there. But, on November 30th, 1840, he was once again caught trespassing in Buckingham. This time, Jones made no attempt to flee the police. Instead, he told anyone who'd listen that he'd sat upon the royal throne, eavesdropped on Victoria's firstborn child crying in its crib, and even spied upon the Queen while she was in her dressing room. These claims landed him in an interrogation session with the Privy Council, the royal family's body of senior advisors. When they commanded him to explain his behavior, he insisted that he was conducting research for a book on royal life. This bald-faced lie infuriated everyone who heard it. When Jones came to trial for a second time, his father testified that he was clinically insane. The judge disagreed. He sentenced Jones to 3 months of hard labor in a London prison. Jones, who was about 16 years old by this point, served his time and was released from prison in March 1841. Then, would you believe it? Less than 2 weeks later, he was arrested for breaking into Buckingham Palace again. By this point, the Privy Council had grown very paranoid. Was Jones a spy? Or maybe an assassin? Why wasn't he learning his lesson? This time, they interrogated him without allowing anybody else inside the room. Jones's father howled about judicial tyranny, but the boy was sentenced to another 3 months of hard labor. The police set a full-time watch on Jones after he served his second term in prison. Then, fearing what might happen if he somehow slipped their notice, they hatched a dubiously legal plot to get him out of Britain. First, a police inspector disguised himself as a Navy recruiter. Next, he bribed Jones to board a ship bound for Australia. Jones agreed to go, but the ship's captain recognized him and refused to let a criminal on board. Undeterred, the undercover police inspector took the teenager to Liverpool and placed him on a ship bound for Brazil instead. Once the ship left port, the police wiped their brows in relief. The boy Jones was finally someone else's problem. But wait, no, he was their problem again. Upon arriving in Brazil, Jones stepped off the ship, looked around, and promptly decided that he liked Britain better. Therefore, he returned immediately to Liverpool. From Liverpool, he walked more than 200 miles to London. In London, he started loitering near Buckingham Palace. You can imagine how angry the police and the royal family must have felt. Although there's not much evidence about what happened next, we know that Jones began to tell his father that strange men were watching him. Then, he vanished with no trace. 2 days after his disappearance, his father received a letter claiming that Jones had joined the Royal Navy and set sail on a journey to America. People interested in the case, including journalists at the Times, alleged that Jones had been kidnapped and sent abroad against his will. Whatever the truth, he remained in the Navy for almost 7 years. The rest of Jones's life is a sad story, but not a surprising one. After leaving the Navy in 1848, he returned to London, where he was arrested for a series of petty burglaries and thefts. Because he gave the police another phony name, the defendant, officially known as John Frost, was sentenced to transportation before anybody realized who he really was. Jones spent the remainder of his life in exile in Australia. In 1893, he died after falling from a bridge while in a drunken stupor. Crucial aspects of the boy Jones story still remain mysterious. For example, 19th century journalists and police inspectors concocted extravagant conspiracy theories to explain how a teenager managed to slip past the royal guards at Buckingham Palace. Today, most scholars believe that Jones simply entered the building through an unsecured ground-level window. They disagree about how many times he did so. The boy was arrested for 3 separate break-ins. Even when he was first caught, however, he already seemed to know his way around the royal residence. It's very probable that he had entered Buckingham at least one time before somebody spotted him. He may have entered many more times than he actually admitted to the police. Alongside the question of how Jones did it, it's worth asking why. After his second break-in, Queen Victoria told her diary that he was a half-witted child. But was Jones a so-called half-wit? Was he mentally ill? Was he a stalker? In my opinion, most posthumous assessments of his character have been pseudoscientific and extremely unconvincing. When modern doctors pathologize Jones as a psychopathic type burdened by an obsessional condition, such as OCD, their diagnoses reinforce a long, problematic intellectual tradition that biologizes crime. Despite what we might wish, it's just not possible to build an airtight case based on Victorian sources. For example, 19th century eyewitnesses who claimed that Jones was a half-wit with a deformed head weren't presenting neutral interpretations of his character. Instead, they were participating in a deeply partisan culture, eager to explain criminality as a symptom of physical defect or mental disease. Today, medical experts who don't read historical sources skeptically enough will inadvertently perpetuate that culture. My heart doesn't bleed for Jones. He made the same mistakes willfully, time and again, despite receiving many chances not to. At the same time, I think that most attempts to understand him as a schizotypal stalker oversimplify the narrative by downplaying both his individual agency and his marginalized position at the bottom of Britain's socioeconomic hierarchy. Rather than regard him solely as a psychological case study, I find it more interesting to imagine how it must have felt to be a needy child living in a slum within immediate walking distance of a royal palace. To my mind, Jones's age and his environment are as vital to an understanding of his actions as whatever mental illness he may or may not have had. Jones's transformation into one of history's first overnight celebrities illustrates the scope and power of Victorian print media. As his story circulated across many different audiences, modes, and genres, the true facts of his case were reinterpreted, forgotten, or discarded altogether. Diverse, semi-fictional versions of Jones appeared in trial reports, political cartoons, medical studies, poems, penny dreadfuls, and stage plays. Today's online memes have parallels in 19th century print culture, where trivial incidents gave rise to vast, tangled networks of self-referential allusions and inside jokes, all of which became increasingly detached from real, material history. The fact that rich and poor alike participated in this culture by enthusiastically consuming and producing it reveals a crucial fact about the Victorian era. Although the urban masses and the oligarchic ruling class confined themselves to separate social spheres, they were never actually as separate as they liked to think. Today, I want to juxtapose two theoretically distinct sides of Victorian culture, the high and the low, in order to expose how often they cross-pollinated with each other. The Boy Jones showed the British public that the worlds of rich and poor were permeable. Like a pauper hiding in the royal palace, 19th century pop culture infiltrated Britain's most respected institutions, dressed itself in glamorous clothing, and attracted the attention of a national audience. My name is Brian Reinken. Welcome to episode 4 of Melting into Air. Chapter 1. Penny Dreadfuls and Popular Fiction. A crowd of 40,000 people gathered outside Newgate Prison on the morning of July 6, 1840. They watched with bated breath as executioners led a hooded criminal to a tall, wooden gallows. While he trembled with fear, the executioners affixed a noose around his neck. They positioned him on a trapdoor. They pulled a lever, he fell, and he wriggled as he died. The crowd cheered with fanatical enthusiasm. Victorian audiences loved a public execution. Like tailgaters at modern sports events, they gathered before dawn to drink and socialize. The atmosphere simmered with the thrilling promise of vengeance. A convicted criminal would be dead by sundown, but so too, maybe, would the crowd enact its justified revenge against the policing and judicial systems that oppressed the poor. Public executions made for an appealing form of entertainment because they were always just a few drinks or a bad decision short of utter lawlessness. Authority gave way to anarchy without much pressure. Although most people in the audience were poor, the middle classes liked to watch a public execution too. Charles Dickens admitted that the death penalty was monstrous in theory. In practice, he saw no better way to defend what he called civilization against criminals who were, in his words, thoroughly evil, antisocial, and wantonly destructive. Of course, not everybody in the middle class approved of hangings. After the novelist William Makepeace Thackeray attended a public execution, he wrote an essay confessing his great sense of shame.
I came away down Snow Hill that morning with a disgust for murder, but it was for the murder I saw done upon the gallows. It seems to me that I have been abetting an act of frightful wickedness and violence.
Whereas Thackeray condemned capital punishment on moral grounds, another middle-class novelist, George W. M. Reynolds, condemned it out of fear that it was corrupting the poor instead of scaring them straight. He complained that
ribald language, obscene jokes, and filthy expressions were heard, and even at that early hour, intoxication was depicted upon the countenances of several whom the law had invited thither to derive an example from the tragedy about to be enacted. Example indeed! Listen to those shouts of laughter!
After a hanging, crowds stampeded to collect a sample of the victim's hair, blood, clothing, or fingernails. Vendors hawked demure statuettes of murderers. Enthusiasts bought paper models of the execution grounds to build and display in their homes. Popular literature showcased the British public's bloodlust and its appetite for crime. Beginning in the 16th century, consumers could buy cheaply printed chapbooks packed with lurid, violent stories like the tale of Dr. Faustus, an alchemist who sold his soul to the devil. From the 18th century onward, spectators at public executions could buy broadsides, inexpensive posters decorated with an image of the criminal and a description of his deeds. During the 19th century, the tradition of chapbooks and broadsides combined with rising literacy rates and innovations in printing to produce a new kind of popular fiction, penny dreadfuls. These works, which were also known as penny awfuls, penny horribles, or penny bloods, were long, serialized narratives printed on the cheapest possible paper and sold, as their name implies, for a penny per installment. For comparison, this made them about 12 times cheaper than an issue of a serial novel such as Oliver Twist. Penny dreadfuls targeted young men and boys with violent, sensationalist narratives, some of which were loosely based on true events. Market pressures drove each story to be lewder, cruder, and more captivating than the one before it. I think the best present-day comparison might be a straight-to-streaming fifth installment of a grotesque slasher franchise aimed at middle schoolers. Because copyright protections ranged from slim to non-existent for most of the 19th century, many penny dreadfuls recycled a small pool of popular characters. The best known of them included Robin Hood, the bandit Dick Turpin, Varney the Vampire, Sawney Bean the Man-Eater, and the cannibal barber Sweeney Todd. The most shameless authors plagiarized best-selling works of literature in the hopes of tricking audiences into buying knockoffs. For example, one notorious penny dreadful tried to poach a few of Dickens' readers by adopting the title Oliver Twiss. That's Twiss. Regardless of their subject matter, most penny dreadfuls were lavishly illustrated with tasteless images of violence. Many of them were also outrageously verbose. Anybody interested in reading Varney the Vampire should be forewarned that it's significantly longer than Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. Rather than presenting one coherent story, many dreadfuls used an open-ended, improvisational narrative technique akin to that of modern soap operas. They lurched in all directions for a new plot twist, and they breathlessly repackaged tabloid news as fresh pulp fiction. The best example of this process is The Mysteries of London, an 1844 novel by George Reynolds, the same writer who complained that poor people weren't scared enough of public hangings. The Mysteries of London is a sprawling, 52-part serial that runs to more than 1,000 pages in most modern editions. Anyone who has the courage to attempt it will embark upon a journey through the labyrinthine streets of London, where they'll come face to face with pirates, robbers, and a terrifying serial killer called the Resurrection Man. This book was far and away the most read work of fiction in mid-19th century Britain. It outsold everything by Dickens, Thackeray, George Eliot, or the Bronte sisters. Today, of course, almost no one has heard of it, and, frankly, it's almost impossible to recommend. One way to appreciate the cultural significance of penny dreadfuls is to understand them as an outburst of post-revolutionary populism. In the decades following the overthrow of Louis XVI, a flood of publications targeting mass audiences swept Britain. Alongside high-minded political pamphlets, tracts, manifestos, and declarations, lowbrow pornography and penny dreadfuls envisioned a world defined by clear-cut moral hierarchies. Some of these publications deliberately violated social taboos by dwelling gleefully upon the seduction or murder of the upper classes by the common people. Others reinforced existing norms by showcasing how criminals eventually receive their just desserts. No matter any particular penny dreadful's politics, middle and upper class audiences often regarded the genre as a whole with loathing and disgust. It was the literature of the mob. Fans of penny dreadfuls knew that they were stigmatized. They simply didn't care. Deliberate provocation was a feature of mass culture in post-revolutionary London. During the early 1830s, the radical atheist and showman Robert Taylor made a reputation for himself as the devil's chaplain. He proudly blasphemed against the established Church of England in frenzied, hysterical public performances that drew hundreds or even thousands of freethinkers, many of whom belonged to the working class. In one particularly famous performance, Taylor summoned hell's worst demons, crying out,
Satan, Beelzebub, Baal, Peor, Belial, Lucifer, Abaddon, Apollyon, thou king of the bottomless pit, thou king of scorpions, appear, appear!
As soon as these demons manifested on stage, a sudden trick of the light transformed them into angels. The performance's message was clear. God and the devil were the same unholy entity. While Taylor's supporters reveled in his scandalous rallies, the political establishment indicted him for blasphemy and sentenced him to prison. Given the link between penny dreadfuls, provocation, and popular culture, few members of the intellectual elite admitted to enjoying narratives like Sweeney Todd. Nevertheless, certain well-respected novelists sometimes deployed shameless spectacle and tasteless thrills to good effect. The Bronte sisters wrote of ghosts, vampires, and a madwoman locked in the attic. Dickens depicted spontaneous human combustion. Even George Eliot described a gruesome French mariticide in Chapter 15 of her novel Middlemarch. The fact that one of the period's most sober novelists decided to include this murder in the period's most sober novel indicates how widely the logic of penny dreadfuls permeated Victorian culture. Surprisingly, the craze for narratives about true crime and bloody violence even seeped into the halls of Parliament. Edward Bulwer-Lytton, a posh Whig member of the House of Commons, published his novel Paul Clifford in 1830. This crime thriller centers on the exploits of a cunning anti-hero, Paul, who leads a double life. By day, he poses as a cultured gentleman. By night, he oversees a gang of greedy bandits. After Paul meets a beautiful young heiress named Lucy, he vows to renounce his criminal lifestyle so that he can marry her. Of course, complications ensue. Paul is arrested and put on trial. The judge is revealed to be his long-lost father. Paul is sentenced to a penal colony. He flees to America. There, at last, he reunites with Lucy and they live as honest citizens forever afterward. Paul Clifford was a hugely popular book, but it wasn't a good one. In fact, its cliched opening lines have gone down in history as shorthand for how not to write. It was a dark and stormy night. The rain fell in torrents, except at occasional intervals when it was checked by a violent gust of wind that swept up the streets. For it is in London that our scene lies, rattling along the housetops and fiercely agitating the scanty flame of the lamps that struggled against the darkness. Today, Paul Clifford's foremost legacy is the annual Bulwer-Lytton Fiction Contest, which awards a prize to whichever writer produces the worst opening line of the year. During the 19th century, Bulwer-Lytton's book enjoyed more genuine respect. It even inspired an entire copycat genre called the Newgate novel, whose plots inevitably revolved around crime and punishment. Like Penny Dreadfuls, Newgate novels were formulaic and commercialized. None of them were works of literary genius. Compared to Penny Dreadfuls, however, Newgate novels targeted a higher class of reader. They were published in expensive 3-volume sets, not one-penny serial installments. Furthermore, unlike the Penny Dreadfuls that reveled in violence for its own sake, Newgate novels anxiously invoked moral language to excuse their graphic subject matter. In the preface to Paul Clifford, Bulwer-Lytton insists that he's writing about crime only so that he can draw attention to the errors of our penal institutions, and prove that there is nothing essentially different between vulgar vice and fashionable vice. The novel strives to teach its audience a lesson. It also presumes that its title character is good by nature. The same is certainly not true of Penny Dreadful antiheroes, such as Sawney Bean the Man-Eater or Sweeney Todd. Bulwer-Lytton exerted an outsized influence on the literature of the 1830s and 40s. In addition to the many copycats that Paul Clifford inspired, his 1828 book Pelham gave rise to a new genre called the Silver Fork novel, which gently satirized the lives of Britain's richest citizens. After the 1840s, Bulwer-Lytton's reputation as a novelist swiftly declined. By 1871, he had been reduced to publishing a bizarre book called Vril, The Power of the Coming Race, in which a master race of telepathic beings lives inside the hollow earth and large, muscular women hunt for scrawny, submissive husbands. Today, the book's main readers are occultist neo-Nazis and internet perverts. The precipitous decline of Bulwer-Lytton's reputation mirrors the fate of Newgate novels more generally. Unlike Penny Dreadfuls, they were essentially a short-lived fad. For one thing, almost all the most important Newgate novels were commissioned by a single team of publishers. When funding from these publishers dried up, so did the genre. Moral panic was the last nail in the coffin. On the morning of May 6, 1840, Lord William Russell, a Whig politician in the House of Commons, was discovered dead in his bedroom. Someone had slit his throat during the night. Police soon arrested the culprit, Russell's Swiss-born valet, François Courvoisier, whom Russell had fired for stealing the household's silver spoons. During the murder trial, journalists alleged that Newgate novels had inspired Courvoisier to break the law. Just like today's cultural commenters often accuse video games of causing violence, Victorian commenters accused popular fiction. Newgate novels, which depended on a respectable middle-class readership, all but disappeared after the 1840s. In contrast, Penny Dreadfuls, which didn't require middle-class patronage to survive, remained extremely popular. Moralists bemoaned that Dreadfuls were becoming penny dreadfuler and dreadfuler, and they advocated the creation of a wholesome new genre called the penny delightful. Unsurprisingly, these campaigns fell upon deaf ears. If anything, Penny Dreadful's readership increased in step with rising literacy rates across the 19th century. Only in the last years of the 1800s did the genre finally fade from relevance. Even then, its extinction wasn't due to moral panic. Instead, Dreadfuls withered in the shadow of new, short-form Gothic fiction written for a literate mass public. During the 1880s and 90s, respectable middle-class writers like Robert Louis Stevenson and Arthur Conan Doyle authored narratives of blood and crime that people of all economic backgrounds could enjoy. These narratives proved so successful that they almost totally supplanted penny dreadfuls in the popular imagination. For example, Showtime's 2014 television series Penny Dreadful foregrounds characters like Abraham Van Helsing, Dorian Gray, and Mr. Hyde, none of whom derive from penny fiction. Ironically, real Penny Dreadful characters, Sawney, Sweeney, and the rest, are nowhere to be seen. Coming up, we'll meet the strangest character ever to haunt the Penny Dreadful's pages, and the only one who's still rumored to prowl the streets of London looking for new victims. Chapter 2. The Legend of Spring-Heeled Jack. Even before the Victorian period, London had acquired a reputation for inexplicable crimes and supernatural hauntings. Between 1788 and 1790, a mysterious man known only as the London Monster stabbed more than 50 women or pricked them with long pins. The victims, who were apparently chosen at random, would be minding their own business in a busy street when, suddenly, the monster would attack them and disappear into the crowd without a trace. Some women were stabbed in the buttocks. Others had their clothes slashed. Some were asked to smell a harmless-looking flower that concealed a needle used to jab them in the face. After a 2-year manhunt, authorities arrested the 23-year-old florist Renwick Williams. Although a judge eventually sentenced him to prison, Williams had a solid alibi exonerating him from the attack that landed him in court. Today, many historians agree that he was innocent. They argue that the crime spree attributed to a single London monster was probably the work of many separate perpetrators. According to this argument, irresponsible reporting by a tabloid press inspired copycat attackers and drew false connections between unrelated crimes. The London monster traumatized his victims without killing them. In contrast, the case of the Hammersmith ghost ended in the death of an innocent bricklayer. Late in 1803, rumors swirled that the ghost of a suicide victim was haunting the Hammersmith district of London. People near the local churchyard kept encountering a tall, thin figure dressed in white. Sometimes, allegedly, it grabbed them. As these encounters multiplied, the neighborhood recruited volunteers, armed them, and placed them on the lookout for suspicious spirits. Few of these volunteers had any previous experience with firearms. Most of them were panicky civilians. Can you guess where this story is going? On the night of January 3, 1804, a jumpy volunteer named Francis Smith spotted a white-clad figure walking down a street in Hammersmith. Smith fired a shotgun, and he killed Thomas Millwood, who'd been walking home after a visit to his parents' house. Smith stood trial for the murder in a case which established that British subjects are legally responsible for criminal actions committed under false beliefs. After Smith was sentenced to hard labor in a London prison, an elderly shoemaker named John Graham confessed that he was the Hammersmith ghost. Just like a Scooby-Doo villain, Graham had used a white sheet to disguise himself and terrorize the neighborhood. Notwithstanding his confession, he was never punished for his actions. The mystery of the Hammersmith ghost was dead and buried. The London Monster and the Hammersmith Ghost set the stage for one of the Victorian era's strangest phenomena, Spring-Heeled Jack's reign of terror. That terror began one night in October 1837, when a servant girl named Mary Stevens was walking through a London park called Clapham Common. Without warning, a shadowy figure pounced from a dark alley, grabbed her, kissed her face, tore her clothing, and touched her bare skin with what Stevens called his claws. Stevens screamed, and her attacker fled. She told the police that the perpetrator's fingers were as cold and clammy as those of a corpse. On the following night, a coachman driving on a road near Stevens' house swerved quickly to avoid hitting a man who sprang out in front of him. When the coachman stopped his vehicle, he heard a high-pitched cackle and watched in stupefied amazement as the man he'd nearly hit leaped over a 9-foot wall and disappeared. Sightings like these continued for several months, until, in early 1838, the Lord Mayor of London received an anonymous letter from a concerned civilian who alleged that an aristocrat was terrorizing local women. The letter, which I'll quote in full, said the following:
"It appears that some individuals, of, as the writer believes, the highest ranks of life, have laid a wager with a mischievous and foolhardy companion, that he durst not take upon himself the task of visiting many of the villages near London in 3 different disguises: a ghost, a bear, and a devil. And, moreover, that he will not enter a gentleman's gardens for the purpose of alarming the inmates of the house. The wager has, however, been accepted, and the unmanly villain has succeeded in depriving 7 ladies of their senses, 2 of whom are not likely to recover, but to become burdens to their families." At one house, the man rang the bell, and on the servant coming to open the door, this worse-than-brute stood in no less dreadful figure than a spectre clad most perfectly. The consequence was that the poor girl immediately swooned, and has never from that moment been in her senses. The affair has now been going on for some time, and, strange to say, the papers are still silent on the subject. The writer has reason to believe that they have the whole history at their finger ends, but, through interested motives, are induced to remain silent.
The Lord Mayor didn't believe this story, but the audience at a public hearing did. Soon, it was reported in the Times, at which point fresh reports came flooding in from all across the city. Someone, or something, had been attacking servant girls. Allegedly, some of the victims had suffered hysterical fits. Allegedly, some of them had even died of fright. The reports disagreed on who or what was perpetrating the attacks. Some of them blamed a tall gentleman with spectacular jumping abilities. Others blamed a flying ghost. Others, a leaping demon. And others, a creature in the shape of a bear or some other 4-footed animal, which growled at people and scurried up brick walls with astonishing speed. Whatever perpetrator was responsible for the mysterious crime spree, the press gave him a flashy name: Spring-Heeled Jack. Jack's reign of terror culminated with 2 uncanny incidents in February 1838, the attacks on Jane Alsop and Lucy Scales. On the night of February 19th, Alsop was visiting her father's house when she heard a knock on the front door. Through that door, a man claiming to be a police officer told her to bring a candle. "We have caught Spring-Heeled Jack here in the lane," he said. When Alsop opened the door, she saw a tall man wearing a cloak. No sooner did she lay her eyes on him than he threw off that cloak to reveal a hideous and frightful appearance underneath. The man wore a very tight, slippery white bodysuit that looked like oilskin, a waterproof fabric. He also wore a helmet, through whose visor Alsop saw red eyes that glowed like burning coals. Before the terrified Alsop could react, the man began to vomit white and blue flames. He snatched at her with metal claws, slashing her arms and neck. She screamed, her sister came running to help her, and the attacker fled into the darkness. 9 days after this attack, the 18-year-old Lucy Scales spotted a suspicious-looking man lurking in Green Dragon Alley. When she approached him, he breathed blue fire in her face. Temporarily blinded, she fell to the ground and suffered an epileptic seizure. When she awoke, the man had disappeared. London's newspapers breathlessly reported the attacks on Scales and Alsop. Soon afterward, a pubgoer named Thomas Milbank had a few too many drinks and started boasting loudly about how he was Spring-Heeled Jack. Milbank was duly arrested. When he came to trial, the prosecution proved that he'd been present at the scene of Alsop's attack. Police found his cloak and demonstrated that he had been wearing tight white overalls. Everyone agreed that Milbank was guilty. Everyone, that is, except Jane Alsop. She insisted her attacker had breathed fire, and Milbank, under oath, swore that this was not a talent he possessed. Because Alsop refused to change her story, Milbank was acquitted and released from custody. Police reports of Spring-Heeled Jack diminished after Milbank's trial, but they never disappeared entirely. The most recent one that I've encountered dates from 2012, when the Martin family and their taxi driver claimed to see a figure dash across the road and leap over a wall 15 feet high. As Jack faded from the 19th century news, however, he assumed a new role as a staple character of penny dreadfuls. Author after author added colorful new details to the original reports, until the true facts of the case were buried underneath a mountain of speculation, hearsay, and fiction. By the end of the Victorian period, Jack resembled a proto-superhero. No longer a serial attacker of women, he was now a dashing vigilante who used his spectacular leaping powers to fight crime. Is it still possible for us to peel away the legend of Spring-Heeled Jack and discern a grain of truth behind the original police reports? Who, or what, really attacked those girls and women in the 1830s? I suggest that there are 4 potential answers, the first 3 of which are all compatible with one another. To begin, there's the single perpetrator hypothesis. The anonymous letter to the Lord Mayor in 1838 alleged that a high-ranking aristocrat was terrorizing London while disguised as a ghost, bear, and devil. That letter didn't name a culprit, but historians have pointed to an Anglo-Irish nobleman named Henry de la Peor Beresford, also known as the Mad Marquis. Beresford, a serial prankster, brawler, vandal, and sex pest, harbored a contempt for society in general and women in particular. One time, in a drunken temper tantrum, he and his hunting companions painted an entire town red, hence our idiom. More to the point, Beresford was notorious for leaping out of bushes and alleyways to terrorize random strangers. There's a lot of plausible circumstantial evidence here, but there's also a serious problem. Beresford died before reports of Spring-Heeled Jack stopped trickling in, which means he couldn't have caused every incident. This brings us to our second possible solution to the mystery. Spring-Heeled Jack may have been the product of a sensationalist press that spawned copycat attacks and drew false connections between unrelated crimes. Nothing about Mary Stevens' original report of an attack in Clapham Commons seems improbable. Here, we find a young woman walking alone at night. She's assaulted by a human perpetrator who has cold and clammy skin, whether from nervousness or from the chill of the October air. His so-called claws are probably sharp fingernails. There's no slippery white bodysuit in this report, no glowing eyes, no fiery breath, and no supernatural jumping ability. Up until the point that rumors about Spring-Heeled Jack began to circulate more widely, the crimes attributed to him were unremarkable. Servant girls from all around the city claimed that someone was attacking them, but there's no need for us to think that it was the same someone every time. Instead, the case of Spring-Heeled Jack foreshadows what the later case of Jack the Ripper would confirm without a doubt. London's vulnerable lower-class women suffered from gendered violence at such an alarming rate that male journalists and police officials wrongly assumed a single devious mastermind must have been orchestrating a campaign against them. But why, in 1838, did so many Londoners believe that such a mastermind must have been supernatural? To that end, the third possible solution to the mystery of Spring-Heeled Jack lies in a combination of popular folk culture and mass hysteria. It's important to remember that the line between the natural and supernatural worlds seemed thinner in the early 19th century than it does today. Few of the scientific laws that we now take for granted were discovered by the 1830s. Furthermore, almost every person in Victorian Britain believed in the reality of demons and the devil. These recognizably Christian convictions coexisted alongside a more nebulous folk superstition that preserved pre-Christian traditions such as the belief in goblins, ghosts, and fairies. We should contextualize all these beliefs in light of the fact that many 19th century Londoners were new residents or seasonal migrants. They had either been born in the countryside, or they still had family members living there. Compared to long-time city dwellers, people from rural England harbored more folkish superstitions. Additionally, their lack of basic street smarts made them uniquely vulnerable to urban crime. London's migrant population was inevitably highest in the winter, when a shortage of agricultural work drove rural people to the capital in search of jobs. Is it a coincidence that Spring-Heeled Jack's attacks increased and became more supernatural during the winter of 1837-38? I have my suspicions, but no one knows for certain. Or maybe I should say that no one knows, except for Spring-Heeled Jack truthers. If you ask them, then the answer to the mystery is that all of the reports were absolutely true, and that an otherworldly being was responsible for terrorizing London's servant girls. Occult writers like Jacques Vallée and John Keel have argued that Spring-Heeled Jack was an interdimensional being, an alien invader from a phosphorus-based planet, or a demon that an alchemist had summoned into our realm of existence. Personally, I find cryptozoology and conspiracy theories to be really fun, but unfortunately, there's no reason to apply them here. Even the attack on Jane Alsop, which might be the eeriest moment in the Spring-Heeled Jack saga, has a logical explanation immediately at hand. Thomas Milbank confessed to the crime, and police discovered evidence supporting that confession. Milbank would certainly have been found guilty if Alsop hadn't tried to make him breathe fire in the courtroom. Faced with these facts, I still want to believe that Spring-Heeled Jack was an invader from another planet, but I feel that I should probably save my credibility to advocate for monsters that really exist. Of course, I mean Bigfoot and Nessie. In the next chapter of this episode, we'll turn from the pages of the tabloid press to the stages of central London. The popular appeal of mustache-twirling villains, hapless heroines, and syrupy orphans helped to make Victorian melodrama one of the most influential forms of entertainment in the modern world. Chapter 3. Victorian Melodrama. Britain has always been a strongly hierarchical society whose elites jealously guard their privileged social status. Sometimes, where no real privileges exist, they need to be invented. In 1737, Parliament passed a Theatrical Licensing Act that imposed legal restrictions on the right to stage so-called legitimate drama. From this point onward, the performance of tragedy, including the works of William Shakespeare, was reserved for just 3 favored London playhouses: Covent Garden, Drury Lane, and the Theatre Royal Haymarket. The city's dozens of unfavored playhouses could now stage only so-called illegitimate genres, such as comedy, pantomime, and dance. Because London's illegitimate theatres vastly outnumbered its legitimate ones, theatrical culture in Britain began to gravitate increasingly toward lowly forms. This was the obvious logic of the marketplace, but it probably wasn't the outcome that the Licensing Act authors had intended. By sealing off elite forms from the masses, they made those forms less relevant and paved the way for a pop-cultural revolution. Just across the English Channel, a different kind of revolution famously broke out in the last years of the 18th century. During the 1790s, the French people overthrew their monarchy, confiscated church lands, and established a republic of free citizens. As the world turned upside down, show trials put it right again for a mass audience. Suspects accused of counter-revolutionary action were compelled to publicly confess their crimes before a crowd. The audience could reasonably expect to see traumatized weeping, hysterical apologizing, and then, depending on the mood of the moment, either a heartwarming scene of redemption and forgiveness, or a harrowing act of retributive bloodshed. Suddenly, the French Republic's revolutionary courts of justice looked a lot like playhouses. Playwrights responded positively to this new development. In 1800, a French dramatist named René Charles Guibert de Picherecourt staged his masterpiece, Selina, or the child of mystery. The drama's plot was cluttered and cliched, but it was perfectly designed to cultivate an intense, almost overpowering sense of emotion in its viewers. Moved by the sheer passion of events on stage, and guided by a constant soundtrack of live music, audiences wept, thrilled, laughed, and wept again. Picharicourt's detractors claimed that Selina was feverish and incoherent. Nonetheless, the play gave rise to a deluge of much-loved imitations. The mélodrame, as this emerging genre came to be known, functioned as a secular substitute for the religious passions that the French Revolution had outlawed. Moreover, it tapped into an escapist thirst for straightforward narratives of good and evil. Like the defendants in a revolutionary court of justice, Selina's characters stood trial in a moral universe, and they always got what they deserved. It didn't take long for the mélodrame to cross the English Channel. In 1802, the London playwright Thomas Holcroft staged a plagiarized adaptation of Selina, which he called A Tale of Mystery. Ordinary British theatergoers didn't mind that melodrama, as they called it, was a foreign art form. Like their counterparts in Paris, they just wanted more, more, more. The genre's soaring popularity among all economic classes remade the world of British theatre almost overnight. No one knew whether to classify it as legitimate or illegitimate art. Because it was a spoken drama featuring sustained musical accompaniment, it seemed to be both things at once. A Tale of Mystery debuted at Covent Garden, a legitimate theatre. Illegitimate theatres, however, seized on melodrama's musical accompaniment as an excuse to stage productions of their own. By the early 1830s, melodramas had become ubiquitous in London. Not coincidentally, a theatre act issued in 1843 effectively abolished the legal dichotomy between legitimate and illegitimate playhouses. Theatre managers now chose freely what to stage, and, almost inevitably, they chose to stage melodramas. But what exactly is a melodrama? Today, the word has pejorative implications. When we call something melodramatic, we mean that its emotions are overwrought to the point of absurdity. Nevertheless, melodrama is a more sophisticated art form than its reputation would suggest. It's also far more influential than we often think. You may not know about Victorian plays like Black-Eyed Susan or The Silver King, but I'm guessing you're familiar with Hollywood movies including The Wizard of Oz, It's a Wonderful Life, Star Wars, Gladiator, and Titanic. Despite the fact that most Victorian melodramas have been lost to history, their direct descendants are familiar to almost everyone alive today. To understand this art form, let's start by addressing the centrality of music. As the genre's name suggests, all 19th century melodramas featured live accompaniment. Just like today's movie soundtracks, stage music helped audiences interpret scenes by telling them what they should feel at any given moment. For example, the stage directions in Holcroft's debut melodrama, A Tale of Mystery, describe
dancing, which should be of the gay, comic, and grotesque kind, with droll attitudes, gesticulations, and bounds. In the midst of the rejoicing, the clock strikes, the dancing suddenly ceases, the changing music inspires alarm and dismay.
Directions like these hint at what stage music might have sounded like in the Victorian era. Unfortunately, historians don't have much other evidence to analyze. The few surviving scraps of sheet music from 19th century plays suggest that soundtracks were often written quickly and anonymously by composers who eagerly plagiarized from other sources. Without better records, it's hard to draw much broader conclusions than this one. After music, 19th century melodrama's most distinctive feature was the tableau. This term comes from the French word for picture, and its plural form, tableau, sounds the same as its singular. The word tableau refers to a dramatic freeze frame that actors would mime and hold at a moment of narrative climax. When a heroine swooned, when a villain was unmasked, or when a hero begged for mercy, all motion on stage would temporarily pause so that viewers could appreciate the power of the scene unfolding before them. Tableau appealed to an audience with a taste for collectible merchandise. After the show was over, Viewers could buy posters of their favorite scenes in the playhouse lobby. A good tableau was also a good marketing campaign. It grabbed people's attention, and it made them want to enter the world of the narrative. That narrative concerned itself almost entirely with plot, not character development. It was extremely formulaic, and it typically upheld a simple, black and white morality system. According to the theater scholar Michael Booth, melodrama conjures a dream world inhabited by dream people and dream justice. It acts as a vehicle for wish fulfillment by envisioning a space where men are men, women are women, good is good, and evil is evil. Melodrama spurns psychological complexity and moral nuance. It directs all action outward, away from the brain, onto the tongue, face, and body. Angry characters will tell you they feel angry, and the music will blare as they do so. If a character is happy, then the sun will shine. If they're sad, then it will start to rain. The melodramatic stage abolishes the tension between how things seem and how they really are. Inner and outer worlds become almost identical. This is the context in which we need to understand melodramatic acting. Today, we often tease soap opera actors, or even big Hollywood stars like Nicolas Cage, because they favor explosive displays of emotion over subtle, naturalistic performances. Our 21st century preference for naturalism, however, is cultural, not innate. During the 19th century, British theatergoers' tastes were very different. Actors often purchased handbooks illustrating the body language of fear, joy, or sadness. In the wrong hands, these books could produce cliched performances. In the right ones, they trained actors how to pivot quickly between very different states of feeling. Melodrama isn't meant to be grounded or realistic. It's supposed to surpass realism and participate in an exaggerated, archetypal realm of human life. To that end, the characters in melodrama tend to be exaggerated archetypes, such as the hero, the villain, and the heroine. The hero is typically a social conservative who's fond of moralizing loudly at great length. Because the hero wants to keep the world exactly as it is, the villain is the engine of the plot. He challenges conventional morality by executing dastardly schemes that almost inevitably endanger the story's heroine. She's the bright light at the center of the melodrama's moral universe. By the end of the play, she almost always falls into the villain's hands. There, she laments her misfortune, and she swoons in terror right before the hero rescues her at the last minute. Alongside the hero, villain, and heroine, 19th century melodramas often feature minor stock characters, such as the old person, the comic relief, and the mute. Narratively speaking, old people's purpose is to express nostalgia for a long-lost moral order that the hero will eventually restore. Some melodramas replace old people with virtuous children, who ask poignant questions about justice and force the adults in the room to smile sadly at their blissful ignorance. Other melodramas deploy children or lower-class workers as comic relief characters who undercut scary moments with jokes. Many plays also cast children as mutes who speak in charades and pantomime. Mutes usually struggle to reveal a secret that's mysterious to everyone except the audience. Dogs occasionally play these roles. Think of Lassie barking by the well. The presence of trained animals on stage attests to melodrama's love of spectacle. Across the 19th century, rival playhouses competed to stage ever more elaborate productions featuring ever more dramatic practical effects. Pyrotechnics, train crashes, cave-ins, floods, earthquakes, and shipwrecks were perennial favorites. One popular Victorian melodrama, The Miller and His Men, climaxed with a real explosion that destroyed a real bridge on stage. Every afternoon, stagehands and technicians scrambled to rebuild the set just so that actors could destroy it later that night. Melodrama thrives in a capitalist culture that imagines resources to be unlimited, consumption to be thrilling, and destruction to be integral to any good production. It's a dramatic form defined by excess on a scale that boggles the mind. In fact, some Victorian theatre critics worried that melodramas literally boggled the mind. These plays shuffled constantly between wildly different settings, subplots, and tones. Conservatives often complained that they battered the brain with pure stimulus, and thereby weakened the audience's attention span. Today, we might compare these fears to paranoia about algorithm-driven social media, especially TikTok. In a 19th century context, melodrama's no-holds-barred approach to entertainment correlated with the growing popularity of the novel, another form that seemed to be a loose, baggy jumble of contrasting genres. For example, over the span of only a few chapters, Oliver Twist pivots from sentimental domesticity to gritty urban realism, and then back again. Dickens actually defended his narrative technique by comparing it to that of what he called good murderous melodramas, which present the tragic and the comic scenes in as regular alteration as the layers of red and white in a side of streaky bacon. As this famous sentence indicates, novelists and melodramatists fed upon each other's styles throughout the Victorian period. On that note, it's worth considering how melodrama's meteoric rise to cultural prominence reflected the wider conditions of 19th century society. According to the literary theorist Peter Brooks, melodrama embodies a post-French Revolutionary urge to reconstruct an essential moral universe in an era when absolute monarchy and institutional Christianity had lost their power to structure the world. Brooks argues that melodrama's moral polarization, its obsessive emphasis on good and evil, reveals deep-seated cultural longing for a new, universal system of morality. At the same time, however, melodrama proves unable to imagine such a system except in deeply personal terms. It understands the world by means of purely good or evil characters, not in light of abstract social systems. In this context, it should come as no surprise that melodrama's politics lean conservative. Faced with complex problems, the style proposes common-sense solutions in the form of vague appeals to kindness, faith, and family. These appeals strive to resolve deep-seated social grievances without making any meaningful adjustments to the status quo. For example, see the very different fates of two Victorian melodramas, John Walker's The Factory Lad and Douglas Jerrold's The Rent Day. Both of these plays appeared at the height of the reform crisis that we discussed in episode 2. Both of them explored the challenge of class conflict. Both asked complex questions about how impoverished people can live ethically under a legal system crafted to exploit them. But, ultimately, all similarities between the two plays end as they present their answers to these questions. In The Factory Lad, a heroic worker murders his greedy employer, then cackles in despair as soldiers prepare to arrest him. In The Rent Day, a family on the brink of eviction miraculously discovers a bag full of money in their house, thereby escaping homelessness forever afterward. The first of these two melodramas, with its stark, pessimistic portrait of class struggle, was critically panned and almost immediately cancelled. The second, with its unlikely happy ending, was universally acclaimed and even revived on multiple occasions in the 19th century. Critics and audiences wanted melodrama's moral compass to point backward, not forward in time. Under these circumstances, almost every melodrama reaffirms that personal reform is preferable to social revolution, that the status quo is ultimately fair and just, and that the nuclear family is the most important part of human life. Melodrama utterly pervaded British culture in the 19th century. Although the term initially referred to a specific genre of theatre, it evolved into a broad stylistic and technical mode that many different genres could adopt. Playhouses staged Gothic melodramas, imperial melodramas, military melodramas, historical melodramas, domestic melodramas, nautical melodramas, and social problem melodramas, not to mention many other kinds. Generically, these plays looked very different from each other. Modally, they shared the political commitments and the formal qualities that I've explored throughout this chapter. Across the Victorian era, remakes and revivals followed one another with increasing frequency. Emotion, spectacle, and music were the public's chief concerns. Originality was never on the list. Today, few theater companies perform Victorian melodrama, and even fewer people read it for its literary merit. Does the form deserve its bad reputation? On the one hand, there's no towering artistic genius here. On the other hand, we should take melodrama seriously because 2 centuries of British and American imperialism have transformed it into an aesthetic language that nearly every person in the world today speaks fluently. Do you like movies and TV shows that have soundtracks? What about stories with good guys and bad guys? Special effects? Stunt teams? Franchising potential? If you're a fan of Disney, Marvel, or James Bond, then you're a fan of melodrama. If you prefer so-called high art, then you may like the work of Douglas Sirk, whose melodramas of suburban life turn quiet desperation into sublime tragedy. Rainer Werner Fassbinder and Pedro Almodóvar deploy melodrama to evaluate the role of race and queer identity in post-war Europe. On TV, meanwhile, almost every single episode of shows like Lost or Grey's Anatomy includes at least one scene of characters who weep while music swells and soars. Those of us who live in the 21st century can't escape the legacy of melodrama. For my part, I wouldn't even want to try. In the next segment of this episode, we'll explore a very different kind of theater from melodrama. How did the Victorian public reimagine the plays of William Shakespeare? Why did certain people feel the need to censor them? And how did skeptics come to doubt that Shakespeare had written them at all? Chapter 4. The Cult of Shakespeare. In 2012, the British actor Kenneth Branagh performed before a television audience of nearly 1 billion people. London was hosting the Olympic Games, and the committee that had planned the opening ceremony wanted to outdo the unprecedented spectacle staged in Beijing 4 years earlier. The pageant that they planned would celebrate more than 1,000 years of British history and culture. As the show began, a hush fell over the Olympic Stadium. Then, Branagh took the field in a Victorian top hat. In a booming voice, he said, "Be not afeard. The isle is full of noises, sounds, and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will hum about mine ears, and sometimes voices that, if I then had waked after long sleep, will make me sleep again. And then,
the clouds, methought, would open and show riches ready to drop upon me, that when I waked, I cried to dream again."
In Branagh's performance, these lines from William Shakespeare's play The Tempest idealized Britain as a marvelous treasure house. Of course, the lines themselves are meant to be the most precious treasure of all. Nothing could be more priceless than the words of the world's greatest poet. But how exactly did Shakespeare earn his reputation as the world's greatest poet? Following his death in 1616, his contemporaries mourned him as a brilliant writer, but they didn't canonize him as a global figure or even a national icon. If you asked British thinkers living in the 17th and 18th centuries to name the foremost poet in their country's history, they probably would have said John Milton, the blind author of Paradise Lost. It wasn't until the 19th century, and especially the Victorian era, that Shakespeare finally achieved the status he retains today. His reappraisal started in the early 1800s, when high-minded Romantic writers imagined him as a self-taught genius who arose from the unlikely soil of small, sleepy Stratford-upon-Avon. Percy Shelley wrote that Shakespeare, from the variety and comprehension of his genius, is to be considered as the greatest individual mind of which we have specimens remaining. In Shelley's eyes, poets were more than merely writers. They were prophets and legislators who channeled divinely inspired messages to humanity at large. I'm sure the fact that Shelley himself was a poet didn't affect his judgment. In 1840, the curmudgeonly Victorian social critic Thomas Carlyle joked that some of his countrymen had begun to speak a little idolatrously of Shakespeare. Nevertheless, He agreed that Shakespeare's poetry was Britain's most glorious possession. "Will you give up your Indian empire or your Shakespeare?" Carlyle asked his readers. "Indian empire will go, at any rate, someday, but this Shakespeare does not go. He lasts forever with us. We cannot give up our Shakespeare." In Carlyle's mind, the only flaw with Shakespeare's poetry was actors' irritating habit of performing it out loud. The stage was no place for a man of genius. Ordinary people would misunderstand the power of his language. Many Victorians preferred to think of Shakespeare as a poet, not a dramatist. They read his material silently, in private. They didn't condescend to see it live on stage. Book publishers capitalized on the craze for a writerly Shakespeare by issuing pricey, multi-volume editions of his work. By the turn of the 20th century, the playwright George Bernard Shaw was complaining about Britain's full-blown culture of bardolatry. The literary taste for Shakespeare, he alleged, had degenerated into a fanatical, quasi-religious obsession. Like the authors of the Bible, the bard loomed larger than life. People bowed before his memory and reverently whispered his name. Shakespeare's journey from a star of the stage to a god of the page illustrates two important developments in 19th century British culture. First, rising literacy rates threatened the prestige of traditional intellectuals, who defended their class privilege by insisting that only a well-educated minority of elite readers could truly appreciate great works of literature. Second, prose began to outsell poetry, which forced intellectuals to invent excuses for a seemingly outmoded literary form. Poetry, they granted, might not make a profit in the marketplace. That was a good thing, however. Its commercial irrelevance guaranteed that shallow material interests would never corrupt its higher artistic agenda. Paradoxically, Victorian intellectuals maintained both that Shakespeare was the property of humankind at large, and that humankind at large could never understand him. In practice, this argument meant that his poetry was something for the elites to bestow upon the masses, or to withhold from them as needed. Shakespeare certainly wasn't something that the masses themselves had once enjoyed in sleazy theaters on the rougher side of town. Of course, the elite perspective is just one side of the story. No matter how the high and mighty felt about it, ordinary readers were an absolutely indispensable part of the 19th century's Shakespearean Renaissance. In 1807 and 1818, the siblings Harriet and Thomas Bowdler published wildly successful editions of a book called The Family Shakespeare. Today, this book is notorious because it sanitized, or Bowdlerized, the language of Shakespeare's plays to make them more appropriate for middle-class women and children. The Bowdlers don't entirely deserve their reputation as finger-wagging prudes, however. Unlike prior censors, they attempted to preserve as much of Shakespeare's text as possible by cutting or revising only a few crucial lines. In my opinion, the play that suffers most from the Bowdlers' editorial interference is Othello. Shakespeare's original version is a story about adultery and interracial sexual desire. By removing nearly all references to adultery and interracial sexual desire, the Bowdlerized text ingeniously makes it a story about nothing. Not all readers approved of the family Shakespeare's moralizing tone, but most of them agreed with its basic premise that Shakespeare's language had the power to shape hearts and minds. To that end, the study of English literature first emerged as an academic discipline during the 19th century, when bureaucrats endorsed lessons in poetry as a strategy to civilize colonized people and the urban poor. Reading Shakespeare helped teach students English grammar and imbue them with a sense of Britain's national destiny. During the Victorian era, plays like Henry V fulfilled the role of secular Bibles for a new generation of literature teachers, who behaved like missionaries on behalf of British culture in classrooms around the world. Shakespeare's work sometimes assumed a more literal religious function. In 1864, his native village of Stratford-upon-Avon hosted a series of sermons to celebrate his 300th birthday. Unfortunately, the venue's acoustics were so bad that the people in the back couldn't hear anything except a distant echo of the preacher shouting, "Shakespeare!" over and over again. Devotional guidebooks, which reprinted Shakespeare quotes alongside relevant passages from the King James Bible, were much better received. One such guidebook compared these sources' use of key terms like mercy and light. As a lesson in Protestant Christianity, this material makes perfect sense. But what on earth are readers supposed to make of the entry for osprey?
From Coriolanus. I think he'll be to Rome as is the osprey to the fish, who takes it by the sovereignty of nature. From Numbers. Among the fowls shall not be eaten the eagle, the ossifrage, and the osprey.
No matter what the logic might have been here, and I have genuinely no idea what it was, devotional guidebooks attest to a broad and popular affection for the works of Shakespeare. To my mind, the best consequence of this affection was a new interest in recovering the original versions of corrupted texts. In 1681, the British playwright Nahum Tate had introduced a censored and rewritten version of the great Shakespearean tragedy King Lear. Among other changes, he eliminated several central characters and gave the narrative a happy ending. The result proved popular with general audiences because it was less shocking. To anyone with better taste, however, it seemed tone-deaf and absurd. The Victorian playwright William Charles Macready scorned Tate's version of King Lear as a miserable debilitation and disfigurement of Shakespeare's sublime tragedy. In 1838, Macready staged a tragic and commercially triumphant King Lear for the first time in a century and a half. This return to Shakespeare's source text amounted to a kind of Protestant Reformation in the secular cult of bardolatry. Of course, the Protestant Reformation produced the wars of religion. Likewise, the reformed cult of Shakespeare soon gave rise to conflict and division. Beginning in the 1840s, certain writers tried to reconstruct the details of the bard's mysterious life based solely on the evidence of his poetry and plays. In doing so, some of these writers came to feel that a man of Shakespeare's humble background couldn't possibly have written any of the masterpieces in his name. The authorship controversy, as it's called today, centers on the bogus claim that Shakespeare's works are packed with secret codes and references suggesting that another person wrote them. Usually, that person is alleged to be a wealthy male aristocrat with privileged access to the highest levels of society. Melting into Air isn't a Shakespeare podcast, so I won't spend time explaining all the reasons why this whole conspiracy is false. But, just so we're clear, it's about as credible as lizard people or flat Earth. Unfortunately, the authorship controversy gained traction among a small group of Victorian elites because it seemed to confirm their prejudice that ordinary members of the public couldn't really understand, or in this case write, great literature. In this context, Shakespeare trutherism helped put lipstick on the pig of standard-issue classism. It's no accident that most conspirators preferred to name aristocrats as the real author of his works. Some of the most rabidly conservative Victorians even used similar arguments to dispute the authorship of slave narratives. They insisted that a black person like Frederick Douglass couldn't possibly produce articulate expressions of his own humanity. Instead, some well-educated white person must have composed all of his memoirs, speeches, and letters. The idea was obviously incorrect, but in fairness, the only alternative was to admit that people who weren't powerful and privileged were still fully human. Ultimately, different interest groups throughout the 19th century held very different attitudes toward Shakespeare, but they all felt compelled to grapple with his legacy in one way or another. Although bardolatry has troublesome roots in colonial literature classrooms and paternalist campaigns to tame the working poor, Shakespeare has since become the property of humanity at large. Even by the mid-Victorian era, unexpected people had begun to make his work their own. In 1853, the Indian playwright Huro Chandra Ghosh staged the first Bengali-language Shakespeare adaptation, Bhanumati Chittobilas, a rewritten Merchant of Venice. In 1899, the 55-year-old French actress Sarah Bernhardt wore men's clothing to portray a 30-year-old Hamlet in a deliberately provocative production. These colonial and gender-bent interpretations prove that Shakespeare's work was a barometer of 19th century culture, not a museum piece that moldered under glass. Then again, who am I to criticize museum pieces? In the next chapter of this episode, we'll discover how exciting and disruptive they could be during the early 1800s. Everyone agreed that Shakespeare was the rightful property of Britain. But was that also true of ancient artifacts inside the British Museum? Chapter 5. The Parthenon Marbles Controversy. It's already a hot day in Athens as the sun begins to rise above the Acropolis, a towering outcrop of rock at the heart of the city. On its summit stands the Parthenon, an ancient temple to the goddess Athena the Virgin. Above the Parthenon's marble columns, brightly painted statues in the pediments used to memorialize key moments in the mythic history of Athens. Beneath the pediments, a decorative band of slabs called metopes once showed heroic Greeks battling against centaurs, giants, Amazons, and Trojans. Encircling the temple's outer walls, another decorative band, known as a frieze, depicted a religious pageant. Today, the sun shines through gaps in the ruins, whose marble statues, metopes, and frieze were stripped away more than 2 centuries ago. The Parthenon remains the pride of Greece, but it's a shadow of its former self. On June 20th, 2009, a crowd of Greek citizens and foreign tourists gathered at the foot of the Acropolis to witness the completion of a project that had taken 30 years to execute. Greece's new Acropolis Museum had collected nearly half the sculptures that survived from ancient Athens. As excited visitors wove through its exhibition halls, they ascended slowly toward the climax of the whole collection. There, in an upper gallery, museum curators had gathered all the Parthenon's stripped artwork for guests to admire from up close. The Acropolis Museum is a triumph of design. Its collection of Greek artifacts is breathtaking. There's just one glaring flaw. Most of the statues, metopes, and frieze slabs in the upper room are plaster replicas. The originals have almost all been on display in the British Museum since the early 19th century. Although Athens has pleaded with London to restore the artifacts to their original home, those pleas have invariably been refused. To understand the origins of this situation, we need to go way back in time. In 1753, that's 84 years before Queen Victoria assumed the throne, several British aristocrats decided to pool their cabinets of curiosity, their libraries, and their art collections in a single trust. The new British Museum belonged to neither king, nor church, nor aristocracy, and it was open to all members of the public. The museum was designed in part to uplift the masses by providing a respectable alternative to vicious pastimes like gambling. Its designers also hoped to cultivate a patriotic sense of British excellence. Museum advertisements reminded the public to feel an honest sense of pride in the possession, by the nation, of many of the most valuable treasures of art and science. These advertisements also promised that admission would forever be completely free of charge for every British citizen. In their words, you are welcome to see your own property. In the second decade of the 19th century, that property included an original copy of the Magna Carta, the Rosetta Stone, the Beowulf manuscript, marble statues of the nation's heroes, a taxidermied hippo, llama, muskox, polar bear, antelope, and elk, along with 3 stuffed giraffes, prehistoric fossils, the clothing, weapons, and tools of so-called primitive civilizations, a golden statue of the Buddha, many classic paintings, and a vast hall of antiquities containing treasures from Egypt, the Near East, and the Mediterranean. Foremost among those treasures were the British Museum's newest and most coveted possessions, the statues, metopes, and friezes taken from the Parthenon. These artifacts, collectively known as the Parthenon marbles, had arrived in Britain after an extremely controversial acquisition process. By the early 1800s, Greece had long since lost its independence to the Ottoman Empire. Athens had become a cultural backwater, and the Parthenon had been reduced into a sorry-looking ruin prowling with looters, who hacked away at stones and harvested their lime. This was the sight that greeted Britain's Thomas Bruce, the Earl of Elgin, when he first visited Athens as a diplomat. Elgin was a military man from a patrician family, and his classical education had given him a sentimental fondness for the world of ancient Greece. Dismayed by the sad state of the Acropolis, he asked Parliament to finance a team of artists capable of making casts and drawings of the Parthenon's surviving sculptures. After Parliament refused, Elgin decided to finance the artists himself. What happened next is subject to debate. We know for certain that Elgin's team erected scaffolding around the Parthenon and started sawing at its stones. Before long, they'd harvested the temple's pediments, metopes, and frieze slabs. After hacking some of this artwork into smaller, lighter pieces, Elgin's men bribed the officials at Piraeus port, loaded the marbles onto ships, and began to transport them abroad. One of the ships sank, at which point Elgin underwrote a successful 2-year recovery expedition at his own expense. Initially, he sent the Parthenon marbles to Malta. Then, in 1816, he delivered them to Britain, where he offered Parliament the chance to buy them. Lawmakers convened a special hearing to determine the legality of such a purchase. This is where things get tricky. Whether for innocent reasons or doubtful ones, the evidence that Elgin gave Parliament became bogged down in translation difficulties, vaguely worded language, overlapping legal jurisdictions, unfamiliar cultural norms, and a he-said-she-said atmosphere of finger-pointing. Elgin assured British lawmakers that the Ottoman government, the civil governor of Athens, and the commander of the Acropolis citadel had all granted him official written permission to harvest the Parthenon's marbles. Unfortunately, he had lost the document that proved this. He could only provide Parliament with an Italian translation that the British embassy had authorized in Constantinople. That translation clearly granted him permission to erect scaffolding around the Parthenon, to make plaster casts of statues, and to take away any pieces of stone with old inscriptions or figures on them. Without the original document, it was impossible to assess the translation's accuracy. To make the situation even more confusing, the translation's language was extremely vague. It said that Elgin's men must not be disturbed while they work, but it didn't specify the nature of their work. It said that Elgin's men were authorized to take away pieces of stone from the Parthenon. But did this mean they were allowed to harvest stones that had already fallen to the ground? Or did it grant them the authority to hack things off the building? In addition to Elgin's legal right to harvest the Parthenon marbles, Parliament scrutinized how he'd behaved himself while moving them out of Greece. Elgin admitted to bribing port officials, but he defended this action as a customary part of business in Ottoman territory. He insisted that he'd never tried to keep his dealings secret, and he told lawmakers that no one had objected to them at the time. Elgin insisted that his only goal was to preserve the Parthenon's timeless works of art from looters who would have destroyed them. He bristled at some lawmakers' suggestion that he was no better than a looter himself. After weighing Elgin's evidence, Parliament decided that his actions were appropriate and legal. Now came the question of whether the marbles were worth buying on behalf of Britain. Lawmakers summoned some of the country's finest artists and historians to testify. They asked these experts absurd questions. Do you think that the bas-reliefs of the centaurs are in the first class of art? Is there not a distinction among artists between a close imitation of nature and an ideal beauty? To some extent, these testimonies were just sound and fury. There was never any serious chance that Parliament would have refused to buy the so-called Elgin marbles. Sure enough, its members consented to the purchase in 1816, at which point the Parthenon's treasures were officially declared to be the property of Britain. The marbles became a cultural sensation as soon as they appeared in the British Museum. William Wordsworth wrote a letter praising them. The poet Felicia Hemans rejoiced that they'd been rescued from the spoilers in Athens. In his famous Ode on a Grecian Urn, John Keats even alluded to a scene from the Parthenon frieze in the line about the heifer lowing at the skies. Although nobody denied the marbles' beauty, many people criticized Lord Elgin for removing them from Greece. Lord Byron, who'd observed the Parthenon's mutilated remains firsthand on a trip to Athens, vented his outrage in a celebrated passage from his poem Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. "Dull is the eye that will not weep to see thy walls defaced, thy mouldering shrines removed by British hands, which it had best behooved to guard those relics ne'er to be restored." Byron was the best-known person to denounce Lord Elgin's actions, but he didn't stand alone. A high-ranking British clergyman condemned the want of taste and utter barbarism of an undertaking that had hacked away huge slabs of stone and left behind a ruin. A well-regarded British travel writer asked, "Had we a right to diminish the interest of Athens?" Naturally, the Greeks themselves answered no. One Athenian man warned a British tourist that "You English are carrying off the works of our forefathers. Preserve them well. Greeks will come and redemand them some day in the future." That day came sooner than anyone expected. From 1821 to 1832, Greece fought a long war of independence against Ottoman rule. A war, by the way, in which Lord Byron lost his life while fighting for Greek freedom. His death on behalf of that cause was his last and most incisive condemnation of Lord Elgin. Following Greece's victory, the makers of the newly independent state identified their small, frail country with the glory of the ancient world. It was natural that modern nation builders wanted to align themselves with heroes from the golden age of Pericles. That didn't necessarily make it logical, however. Modern Greeks were Christians, or even Muslims, not Hellenic pagans. Many of them, furthermore, had Turkish, Slavic, or Italian ancestry. They literally weren't descended from the citizens of ancient Athens. Nonetheless, the ancient world offered a tantalizing myth of blood and soil nationalism. In 1836, Greece's newly crowned King Otto formally requested the repatriation of the Parthenon marbles. The British Museum ignored his request for a decade. At last, in an insulting gesture, it sent him a set of plaster casts. Today, Greek demands for Britain to repatriate the Parthenon marbles remain unresolved. The British Museum has repeatedly said that although it's willing to lend the marbles back to Athens, it will never agree to sign them away permanently. The standard argument against repatriation generally revolves around 5 claims. First, because the British Museum has displayed the Parthenon marbles for longer than the modern state of Greece has even existed, they've become a crucial part of British heritage and culture. Second, the British Museum's collection reminds the public that ancient Greece belonged to a vibrant network of sister civilizations, such as Egypt. Moving the Parthenon marbles to Athens would obscure this important fact by treating them in isolation from other ancient cultures. Third, compared to Athens, London is more accessible to the global public. If the Parthenon marbles were transferred to Greece, fewer people would be able to visit them. Fourth, Lord Elgin saved the Parthenon marbles from destruction. If he hadn't taken them from Athens, they wouldn't have survived at all. Fifth, and most importantly, law courts have repeatedly ruled that the Parthenon marbles were acquired legally by the standards of the 19th century. Lurking just beneath the surface of these arguments against repatriation, there's a sinister 6th claim that few people publicly espouse. If the British Museum were to repatriate the Parthenon marbles, it would set a precedent that could make it legally vulnerable in any future ownership disputes with foreign nations. After all, the Parthenon marbles are far from the only contested items in the collection. The museum acquired many of its holdings through the straightforward logic of imperial plunder. Compared to the arguments against repatriation, the arguments in favor are easier to summarize. The Parthenon marbles are ancient Greek artifacts. The Ottoman government had no authority to give them away, Lord Elgin had no right to take them, and now the modern Greeks would like to have them back. It's worth noting that each side of this debate relies upon a different rhetorical strategy. Those in favor of repatriation tend to invoke cultural heritage, national pride, and international diplomacy. Those against it frame the conversation around cultural preservation, public access, and international law. Because the two sides fundamentally disagree about the rules of the conversation they're having, they've talked past each other for 2 centuries and counting. In any case, both sides have their flaws and limitations. On the one hand, arguments in favor of repatriation can sometimes become racially essentialist and politically revanchist in ways that place liberal-minded scholars and curators in an unnatural alliance with far-right politicians and culture warriors. On the other hand, arguments against repatriation cynically mobilize centuries of legal precedent as a fig leaf to conceal an otherwise naked display of imperial privilege. Scholars and activists sometimes frame the Parthenon marbles as a generalizable case study capable of offering useful guidance to participants in other unresolved repatriation struggles. For what it's worth, I think that this case is so unusual that most efforts to generalize it are consigned to failure. Regardless of your stance on Elgin's actions, they were obviously more complex than simple thievery. The debate about them has endured for so long partly because the facts are unusually hard to parse. That debate has also endured because it concerns 2 European countries. From Byron's time to ours, the case of the Parthenon marbles has made headlines because of Philhellenism, or the love of ancient Greece. Meanwhile, other repatriation debates, such as Britain's ongoing disputes with Egypt and Nigeria, have attracted far less international attention, even though the artifacts in question were far more obviously stolen at gunpoint. In the end, the debate over the Parthenon marbles is a bizarre and anachronistic holdout of British imperial privilege. Britain lost its territorial, political, military, and economic preeminence in the world at least 60 years ago. For it to surrender the cultural sphere too would be to concede, at long last, that it has become a nation just like any other. Rather than admit defeat, the British Museum has preferred to play hardball. It has staked its future as an institution on the gamble that its collection is so good that other museums around the world will have no choice except to cooperate with it for loans and acquisitions. This too-big-to-fail model is losing traction, and it certainly hasn't made the museum many friends abroad. I think it's possible that we may see the end of the British Empire in our lifetimes. You'll know it's really over if you find the Parthenon marbles inside the Acropolis Museum. In the next chapter of this episode, I'll discuss another institution of high culture, Britain's National Gallery. Its creators deliberately placed it where the rich rubbed elbows with the poor, and they regretted that decision almost every single day throughout the 19th century. Chapter 6. Class Tensions in the National Gallery. When I look back on 19th century Europe, one thing that consistently surprises me is the passion with which ordinary people pursued and defended their right to see great works of art on display inside museums. Before photography, television, and the internet, the best way to observe a masterpiece of painting was to visit it in person. The beauty and the cultural prestige of a scene by Raphael or Michelangelo could transform a trip to an art gallery into a kind of religious experience. For example, the French novelist Stendhal suffered an emotional breakdown during a tour of Florence in 1817. Overwhelmed by what he called sublime beauty and celestial sensations, he nearly fainted in the Basilica di Santa Croce. Even today, some guests in art galleries experience Stendhal syndrome, a feeling of intense psychosomatic distress caused by the exposure to great art. France took pride in the Louvre, Spain in the Prado, Florence in the Uffizi. All of these art galleries were celebrated public institutions. In contrast, Britain's closest equivalent, the Royal Collection, was reserved for private display only. Following the French Revolution, Britain's lack of a public national gallery gradually became a source of patriotic embarrassment. Rightly or wrongly, British citizens understood their country as a place where ordinary people enjoyed unparalleled rights and freedoms. Why, then, did they lag behind their European peers when it came to the right to look at art? Parliament's decision to establish a national art museum in 1824 was an exercise in international relations. For one thing, it affirmed that Britain was a modern state, whose people, like their counterparts abroad, could see great masterpieces free of charge. For another thing, it simplified the process of buying and selling paintings. The Napoleonic Wars had plunged the European art world into anarchy. Revolutionary politicians confiscated royal holdings, and looted artwork crossed international borders on dozens of different black markets. Founding a national gallery empowered the British government to stabilize this system by directing all transactions through a single, legal channel. When the National Gallery first opened to the public, it was housed inside a London banker's townhouse. By 1838, however, that townhouse had become so cramped and stuffy that it seemed undignified. One of King William IV's last recorded statements dismissed it as a nasty, poky hole. Accordingly, Parliament voted to move the National Gallery to its present-day location in Trafalgar Square. Lawmakers then commissioned the architect William Wilkins to design a grand neoclassical temple of the arts, whose scale and beauty would imply that modern Britain had inherited the majesty of ancient Rome. Unfortunately, budget cuts impeded these grandiose plans. Wilkins was forced to downsize his original design to the point that it would hardly be less crowded than the stuffy townhouse. To make matters worse, he was forced to recycle the new building's stone facade from pre-existing structures. The only columns available were shorter than he'd wanted, which made the new National Gallery look even smaller than it really was. Long before the building had been finished, people were complaining it was ugly. The neo-Gothic architect Augustus Pugin, who was hard at work rebuilding the Houses of Parliament, cited it as a prime example of classical style's degeneracy. The new National Gallery's location was part of the problem. The government had cleared Trafalgar Square only a few years earlier. Prior to that, the area had been densely packed with stables, and its proximity to military barracks had given it a seedy reputation. It was nowhere near as run down as a slum like Whitechapel, but soldiers inevitably attract alcohol and gambling and prostitutes. Idealistic lawmakers ignored these obstacles and insisted that Trafalgar Square's shady reputation actually made it an appealing venue for an art museum. Geographically, the square sat between a neighborhood of palaces and a neighborhood of pubs. According to the Tory politician Robert Peel, it was the perfect place to cement the bonds of union between the richer and the poorer orders of the state. Of course, Peel didn't think the rich and poor should bond as equal partners. Just like the British Museum, the National Gallery upheld a strongly paternalistic assumption that contact with great works of art would uplift, educate, and civilize the lower classes. Just like the British Museum, moreover, the gallery often seemed to harbor feelings of contempt for the public whom it claimed to serve. Staff members issued tornadoes of edicts warning guests not to shout, not to crowd, not to shove, not to touch, not to run. Because these edicts went ignored, Parliament repeatedly summoned the gallery's directors to testify about the public's misbehavior. All the while, the gallery grew more popular. On one exceptionally busy day in 1840, more than 14,000 people visited its 5 tiny rooms. About halfway through the 19th century, Parliament approved an expansion plan. Then, in a gesture that perfectly symbolized the project's class prejudice, the construction team tore down a workhouse to make room for the National Gallery's new wing. The desperate people living in that workhouse were expelled onto the streets and forced to fend for themselves. Class privilege belied the National Gallery's blithe promise to treat all its visitors equally. Queen Victoria meddled in its hiring decisions, and wealthy lawmakers reviewed the purchases it made. As a result of these two factors, the gallery remained snobbish and conservative even by 19th century standards. Whereas Germany's newest art museums organized collections chronologically to teach guests about art history, the National Gallery arranged paintings by subjective standards of aesthetic excellence. According to the art historian Neil MacGregor, who once served as the gallery's director, there was not a hint of education, not a hint of scholarship in the facility's original layout. Members of Parliament only wanted to buy beautiful art, and their ideas of beauty were extremely limited. To cite just one absurd example, the gallery's first director spent years begging Parliament to purchase some early Renaissance paintings. He succeeded only by convincing lawmakers that showcasing early Renaissance art would help the British public appreciate how ugly and unsophisticated it was in comparison to later works by well-regarded painters such as Raphael. Class prejudice also shaped the gallery's policies on cleanliness and preservation. Throughout the Victorian era, privileged writers alleged that exposure to the lower classes threatened to degrade great works of art. Not only did poor people poke at canvases, their body odor also produced harmful chemical reactions in the oil paints. Ironically, the National Gallery's overzealous drive to preserve its paintings actually damaged them far more than any visitor had ever done. Professionals who attempted to clean and restore priceless works of art by Rubens or Velázquez smeared them and wiped out their colors. One cartoon in the satirical magazine Punch depicted gallery curators hanging paintings on a line and beating them like dusty rugs. The accusation seemed ridiculous, but it wasn't too far from the truth. Even more than overzealous cleaners or ill-mannered guests, air pollution threatened the longevity of paintings. The coal fires that heated Victorian London, including those that heated every single room of the National Gallery, produced huge volumes of soot, smoke, and sulfur dioxide. By the 1840s, Britain's capital had become the most polluted city on the planet. Because lawmakers could see, smell, and taste that air pollution was a serious problem, some members of Parliament repeatedly proposed moving the National Gallery from the city centre to suburban neighbourhoods like Kensington or Highgate, where the air was easier to breathe. Opponents of this proposal denounced it as a thinly veiled plot against the poor. They argued that moving the gallery to a wealthy suburb would make it much less accessible to the members of the working class. In 1857, Parliament formed a commission to collect data on how often those members actually visited the National Gallery and the British Museum. The results were astonishing. The vast majority of surveyed workers had visited these institutions at some point in their lives. Many of them visited one or the other on a regular basis. Despite these data, the lawmakers who'd proposed to move the National Gallery to a suburb dug in their heels. One politician argued that poor people could walk to Kensington if they really wanted to. That way, they would get some exercise as well as some culture. Other lawmakers, in contrast, felt deeply moved by the commission's findings. In the words of one High Court judge,
"If it were demonstrable that the pictures in the National Gallery's present position must absolutely perish sooner than at Kensington, I conceive that this would conclude nothing. The existence of the pictures is not the end of the collection, but a means to give the people an ennobling enjoyment. If, while so employed, a great picture perished in the using, it could not be said that the picture had not fulfilled the best purpose of its purchase, or that it had been lost in its results to the nation."
In the end, the National Gallery remained in Trafalgar Square. The debate over whether to move it actually strengthened the institution's idealistic commitment to serve all British citizens, regardless of their economic class. True, that commitment had been tested many times. True, the gallery had sometimes failed to live up to its mission. After the debate, however, people of all backgrounds felt prouder and more protective of their paintings than they ever had. When Nazi Germany bombed London during World War II, the National Gallery's artwork was evacuated from Trafalgar Square and sent to Wales for safekeeping. Some members of Parliament proposed sending the paintings to Canada, but Prime Minister Winston Churchill refused. "Bury them in caves or cellars," he said, "but not one picture shall leave these islands." A letter written to the Times at the height of the Blitz argued that ordinary Londoners needed to see the National Gallery's paintings because they provided comfort in a time of hardship. Accordingly, the government decided to display one masterpiece in London every month. The painting would hang on public display at all times except during bombing raids, when caretakers would move it to a cellar for safekeeping. Ultimately, the history of the National Gallery should remind us that high culture and the mass public are not mutually exclusive. Because the gallery was universally beloved, Trafalgar Square became a forum where Victorian Londoners debated the nature of patriotism, the meaning of Englishness, and the future of the British Empire. Sometimes, national pride won out, as when Nelson's Column, a towering monument to a wartime hero, was erected in the early 1840s. At other times, Trafalgar Square hosted huge rallies in favor of countercultural projects like labor reform or Irish Home Rule. During the Bloody Sunday protests of 1887, tens of thousands of demonstrators clashed with police officers around Nelson's Column. In 1913 and 1914, radical suffragettes bombed Trafalgar Square and other symbols of the nation, including Westminster Abbey. These incidents scandalized Parliament, but, in their own way, they also confirmed that the National Gallery's founders had been right to move the building to Trafalgar Square. Whether for better or worse, the rich were rubbing elbows with the poor. In the next chapter of this episode, we'll take a trip from London to the English countryside, where we'll explore the violent birthplace of a violent sport. Chapter 7. Thomas Arnold's Rugby School. Around age 11, you board a train that whisks you to a school located in a Gothic castle in the English countryside. After meeting the mysterious old headmaster, you join a house of students who become your family. In class, you're required to memorize strange-sounding words imbued with hidden power. You don't pay much attention to your lessons, though. You're too busy dueling with school bullies, training with your teammates on the sports pitch, and drinking copiously in the village pub. Your years as a student will transform you into an adult defined by courage, friendship, and fair play. No, you're not enrolled in Hogwarts. You're at a Victorian public school. Confusingly, a British public school is what Americans would call a private school. These institutions are public in the sense that children without noble parents can attend them. They are, however, extremely expensive, which means that only wealthy families can afford tuition. During the 19th century, the vast majority of public schools only admitted boys. Most children first enrolled around the time of their 11th birthday. They remained in school until they were about 18, at which point they applied to university at places like Oxford or Cambridge. Public schools were training grounds for the Victorian era's young elites. They created exclusive, insulated worlds comprised of a few hundred well-connected people, most of whom knew one another, many of whom intermarried, and all of whom could seek out favors via alumni networks. The best public schools acquired legendary reputations. We could talk at length about Eton, Westminster, or Harrow. Today, though, I want to discuss Rugby School, whose reputation came to outshine all the others. Rugby School was founded in the English countryside in 1567. By the 18th century, its students hailed from wealthy families nationwide. At the start of every school year, they descended on the tiny local village like a conquering army. Picture a small college town on Friday night, but imagine that the students are all boys aged 9 to 17. They're getting blackout drunk in your backyard, stealing apples off your trees, fishing in your pond, hunting on your land, forming gangs, breaking windows, and catcalling women. Unfortunately, they're your town's main source of revenue, so you have no choice except to tolerate their actions. If it's any consolation, the boys treat all their teachers just as poorly as they treat the townspeople. Prior to the 18th century, most of England's upper-class children had been educated in their homes by private tutors. Socioeconomically, these tutors were essentially the hired help, and their pupils spoke to them like servants. As boarding schools like Rugby grew more popular, well-born students proved slow to realize that their teachers didn't work directly under daddy anymore. These students often chafed at taking orders from a commoner. They smirked, they jeered, they screamed and spat, and wrote offended letters to their parents. Meanwhile, teachers violently fought back. The English writer Lytton Strachey described the average Victorian public school as a system of anarchy tempered by despotism. Misbehaving students received fierce and frequent punishment in the form of the rod, a long birch wand that teachers used to strike them on their hands or their bare buttocks. Whenever teachers physically abused their students, they inadvertently taught the students to abuse each other. The most heinous kinds of bullying imaginable were commonplace at public schools. This bullying was almost always physical. Very often, it was sexual as well. Because there were no girls at rugby, the atmosphere resembled that of prison or the military. Sometimes the likeness went too far. During the so-called Rugby School Rebellion of 1797, a mob of disgruntled teenagers looted and burned the campus until the British Army finally stepped in to quell the violence. The rebellion's ringleaders were expelled, but they received no legal punishment. One of them, Willoughby Cotton, would grow up to command several controversial military expeditions, including the invasion of Afghanistan and the suppression of the Great Jamaican Slave Revolt. By the 1820s, it was obvious that Britain's public schools faced chronic structural problems. They'd spent centuries catering to the well-born children of English politicians, landlords, clergy, and generals. Now, nouveau riche industrialists and merchants, many of whom were Scottish, Welsh, or Irish, were looking for a place to educate their sons. Instead of capitalizing on this demographic shift, most public schools attempted to preserve an aristocratic English student body by sharply increasing tuition rates. This plan backfired almost immediately. Once new money families started to take their sons elsewhere, the headmasters of public schools realized that, like it or not, their institutions literally could not afford to lose new clientele. But here's another structural problem. Once the nouveau riche started to shop around for other options, they grew disillusioned with the nation's public schools. The routine cruelty seemed barbaric. Staff layoffs and salary cuts had reduced teachers' credentials and morale. Finally, some public school facilities were literally centuries out of date. Faced with these overlapping crises, desperate headmasters commissioned new dormitories, cleared new parkland, and constructed new sewage facilities to keep human waste off the streets. While these reforms preserved the English public school system, one particular headmaster's work transformed it. Thomas Arnold grew up in a stern Anglican family that offered him few opportunities for spontaneity, laughter, or play. As a result, he became a shy, self-serious boy whose greatest passion was following the rules. When he enrolled in public school at Winchester, his housemates beat him up because he piously knelt down to pray before he went to bed each night. Despite serious bullying, Arnold managed to graduate from Winchester at just 15 years old. Soon afterward, he experienced his first religious doubts at Oxford University. But, rather than exploring them, he doubled down on his beliefs by adopting a quasi-monastic lifestyle and abandoning any academic pursuit that made him question his faith. Arnold believed that an unprecedented global struggle between good and evil was approaching, and he feared that English intellectuals had failed to mobilize the nation for God's coming judgment. After he became the headmaster of Rugby School in 1828, Arnold tried to remedy that failure. He published an avalanche of pamphlets, tracts, and articles, all of which philosophized vaguely about ponderous subjects like virtue. He insisted that he was a forward thinker and a staunch progressive. Most of what he wrote implied a very different vision of humanity, however. Arnold was a raging anti-Semite who despised welfare recipients nearly as much as he mistrusted all Enlightenment ideals. To be frank about my biases, I regard him as an uninspiring and uncritical thinker. I also suspect that he was a downright boring person. During a trip to Europe, he yawned and sneered his way through some of history's most fascinating destinations. After visiting Pompeii, for instance, he said that he would rather have toured the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah. They would have been more solemn and less lecherous. 19th century Britain didn't share my hostile view of Thomas Arnold. Quite the opposite. The Victorians elevated him into a kind of secular saint in honor of the far-reaching reforms that he enacted at Rugby School. To that end, Arnold encouraged rowdy students to cultivate a gentle form of masculinity that valued honesty, dutifulness, and compassion. He upheld these values in his famous sermons, which he required students to attend and which he published in handsome volumes purchased by the likes of Queen Victoria. Many of Arnold's sermons compared his own behavior to that of Jesus Christ. Then, sometimes on the very same page, they warned that God would punish cruel and idle little children with eternal hellfire. Several of Arnold's reforms centered on student life. The boys at Rugby all belonged to houses, each of which was subdivided into many different forms roughly akin to academic years. Students could test into a higher form if they were intellectually gifted or if they'd had prior schooling. Likewise, they could be held back if they failed their exams. These policies meant that, although most boys in a given form were the same age, a few were always older or younger than the rest. Together, Rugby's houses and their forms gave rise to a peculiar culture of student servitude. Boys in lower forms washed clothes, folded bedsheets, lit candles, shined shoes, fetched snacks, and even warmed toilet seats on behalf of boys in higher forms. This system typically kept the students orderly and the dorms clean. Arnold, however, recognized that it also produced tension and even danger, especially when an older boy was assigned to serve a younger one who was technically enrolled in a higher form. Rather than trying to stamp out all power hierarchies among Rugby's students, Arnold wanted to secure control of them. As headmaster, he introduced the praepostor system, better known as the prefect system, which allowed him to appoint promising sixth form boys as deputies invested with the power to lead, police, and punish other students. Arnold required the prefects to dine with him at least one time per week. The fact that most of them saw this requirement as a privilege, not a punishment, testifies to his popularity. By means of his sermons and the meals he ate with prefects, Arnold deliberately stoked a cult of personality. Rugby boys revered him, gobbled up his ideology, and parroted it back at one another till the day they died. Could he have developed such a cult of personality if he'd spent his career around adults instead of children? Personally, I doubt it, but because he won the hearts and minds of Britain's young elites, they did everything they could to honor him once they grew up. Many of his former pupils became headmasters at their own schools, which they remade in Rugby's image. As a result, Arnold became a founding father of the Victorian era. Arnold's humorless lifestyle may have contributed to his premature death from a heart attack in 1842. Although his dedication to Rugby School had always been completely and utterly earnest, he ultimately failed to address two core problems. For one thing, he'd remade the school through personal charisma, but he left no charismatic leader to succeed him. The headmasters in Arnold's wake were all comparatively impotent, a fact that we can probably blame on his reluctance to establish an effective educational bureaucracy. Rather than teachers, he preferred to do business through schoolboys. Arnold's more serious failure was his refusal to modernize Rugby's curriculum, which focused overwhelmingly on Greek and Latin. In his defense, this problem was extremely common across public schools. Some taught a bit of math, a little modern history, and even a smattering of biblical Hebrew, but, in general, students spent the vast majority of their time and energy reading Caesar, Cicero, and Virgil. The sheer uselessness of Latin was its most attractive feature. A public school education proved that a boy and his family could afford to cultivate leisure. Values were shifting quickly in Victorian Britain, however. Although some nouveau riche merchants, industrialists, and shipping magnates wanted their sons to learn Latin so that they could join the traditional ruling class, many others warned their children not to waste time studying a dead language instead of something practical, like engineering. Arnold was a staunch conservative during a time of social change. He structured classes around memorization and recitation, not critical thinking. Furthermore, he often assigned Greek and Latin lines as punishment, which strangled any passion that his students might have felt for ancient languages. Rugby schoolboys feared their Latin texts. Instead of learning how to swim through foreign sentences, they desperately tried not to drown. On the rare occasions when Arnold agreed to introduce curricular reforms, they were so minor and half-hearted that it's hard not to see them as funny. For example, he insisted that French lessons should never include any speaking or listening components. There was no good reason why a self-respecting Englishman would ever need to use a foreign language in real life. Arnold was even more reactionary when it came to science education. He said that he would rather have a child who believed the sun revolved around the earth than a child forced to study subjects that might challenge his religious faith. Public schools' outdated curricula slowly eroded their good reputation. In 1864, the British government appointed the Clarendon Commission to investigate their academic standards. The commission's final report was politely worded, but extremely pessimistic. The facts and figures do not indicate an average of classical attainment which can, by any stretch of indulgence, be considered satisfactory. Despite public schools' emphasis on Greek and Latin, most students could barely comprehend these languages. Worse yet, these students showed great deficiencies in English composition, reading, and spelling. Lawmakers refused to act upon these warnings. Most of them had once attended institutions such as Rugby, and they all took pride in what they learned, or failed to learn. Consequently, academic standards in the nation's public schools remained unchanged. While academics fossilized, athletics flourished. In theory, sports taught students valuable life lessons about leadership, teamwork, and fair play. No less a figure than the Duke of Wellington allegedly remarked that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. The game of rugby, which was invented at Rugby School in the early 1800s, cultivated courage and aggression. Cricket forced talented individuals to think as a group. Rowing allowed students to reenact the golden era of Athenian military power. Unfortunately, sports eventually began to crowd out studying. The future Prime Minister Clement Attlee once grumbled that nobody at a public school was considered anything unless he was good at games. From his perspective, schools with sports teams had become more like sports teams with schools. Some historians have argued that the British Empire as a whole was governed like a massive public school. Almost all its top officials had been educated at places like Rugby or Eton. When they were stationed overseas, they formed exclusionary cliques that met in segregated clubs like houses. They espoused fair play and sportsmanship, while mercilessly bullying their enemies and their subordinates. Of course, running an empire like a public school had serious drawbacks. In 1916, British soldiers were mowed down in the tens of thousands on the Somme because their leaders didn't realize that machine guns and artillery made performative shows of manly courage suicidal rather than heroic. The rules of war and politics evolve. The rules of rugby don't. In hindsight, the 19th century was the golden age of public schools. Dozens of new institutions were founded from the 1820s through the 1860s. They churned out politicians, generals, diplomats, writers, and clergy at astonishing rates. All but one Victorian Prime Minister was educated at a public school. Even the one exception, Benjamin Disraeli, always wished that he had gone to Winchester. Many other people wished that they had gone to Rugby. In 1857, one Rugby alumnus, Thomas Hughes, published the novel Tom Brown's School Days, a thinly veiled account of the best years of his life. The book's tales of cricket, bullies, and headmasters romanticized the public school system and kick-started an entire genre of school novels aimed at children. Ironically, these novels became popular among adults as well. People of all ages loved to fantasize about a world in which they were rich, athletic, and popular. They knew that they would never really have the money to attend a public school, but wistful dreams of unlived lives were half the fun. We shouldn't look down on these readers for their fantasies. Things aren't so different in the present day. If you're anything like me, then you know more than one millennial who's still half hoping that the Sorting Hat would place them into Gryffindor. Conclusion. a side of streaky bacon. Throughout this episode, we've encountered at least two distinct meanings of the word culture. The first refers to something that you passively inhabit, something into which you're born. It includes your customs, language, foods, clothing, dances, and songs. Anthropologists study this kind of culture, which all human beings possess. In contrast, the other kind of culture refers to something that you actively choose and consciously pursue. It's difficult and even painful to acquire, and it's something you can easily lose if you don't practice it. This is the kind of culture treated as a status symbol. Think of your aptitude in classical Chinese calligraphy, your fluency in dead languages like ancient Greek, or your knowledge of the English literary canon. The conceptual distinction between these two meanings of culture, the distinction between what's often understood as high and low, originated in Victorian Britain. During the mid-19th century, the British middle class was growing larger. More people worked white-collar jobs, and the masses acquired the money to attend the theater, or the races, or the nation's beach resorts. As long-standing distinctions between Britain's economic classes started to grow blurrier, the idea of culture emerged as a promising new way to maintain differences between particular groups of people. The cash-strapped aristocrat whose daughter married a rich but common-born factory owner sneered that his new son-in-law had never read Herodotus. The boy was new wealth. He had money, but not social status. Alternatively, the law clerk whose parents had been semi-literate laborers distanced himself from his shameful lower-class upbringing by purchasing a handsome edition of Shakespeare's collected plays. The real economic gap between him and his parents may have been minuscule, but the imagined cultural gap between them reassured him that he inhabited a higher social class than his less educated family members. The ideological border between high and low culture became more heavily guarded at precisely the moment when it grew much easier to cross. Snobbish Victorians like Matthew Arnold, the son of Rugby School's headmaster, scrambled to seal off high culture from the so-called Philistine masses. In spite of their efforts, Shakespeare became a household name. The British Museum and the National Gallery welcomed guests from every social class. Even Rugby School and other elite academic institutions had no choice but to admit the common-born sons of wealthy merchants and tradespeople. In theory, Victorian culture resembled a pyramid that narrowed as you neared the top. In practice, it looked more like a side of streaky bacon, where the rich red meat and the pale white fat were juxtaposed on the same strip of flesh. I think it's wonderfully appropriate that some of today's most beloved Victorian artifacts have endured because they appeal to all kinds of audiences. Novels like Oliver Twist, Jane Eyre, Middlemarch, or Wuthering Heights are taught in universities, but they're also, oftentimes, some of the first serious books that young people willingly read on their own. To some extent, if never totally, these novels straddle the boundaries between socioeconomic classes. They are all things to all people. But I'm getting ahead of myself when I refer to mid-Victorian attitudes toward culture. In the 1840s, where our story ends today, the chasm between Britain's economic classes was still widening, not narrowing. Mansions and slums both grew larger as the smoke of the Industrial Revolution seeped into cities like Manchester, where life revolved around the cotton textile mills. In the next episode, we'll journey from London to the English provinces, where two processes, enclosure and industrialization, laid the groundwork for an economic transformation that defined the British 19th century and the fate of the entire world since then. Tune in next time as we explore topics like railway mania, the engineering marvels of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, and a politically inflammatory poem about a goose. I'm Brian Reinken. I hope you'll join me next time. Thanks for listening to Melting into Air. If you enjoy this show, please leave a comment and subscribe on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about this episode, you can visit our website at meltingintoair.net, where we've posted show notes, artwork, and a movie list. If you'd like to help keep the show running, please visit our Patreon for exclusive content and other membership benefits. You can always reach us at info@meltingintoair.net. This is Brian Reinken. See you in episode 5.